Hello, everyone. I'd like to do a video reviewing the review questions for Gray's The Idea of Death in Existentialism. Number one, according to Gray, why has modern philosophy pretty much ignored the subject of death? Well, the thing about modern philosophy, and when we read about history of philosophy, history of Western civilization, really, the word modern is used very broadly, so that modern philosophy could be things written in the 17th century. Modern is really a way of marking off the modern world from the medieval world, the world of the Middle Ages in Europe. And that is a way of marking off from the ancient world. So we're talking very broadly modern. But this is something that Gray discusses in the beginning of the essay. It really has to do with metaphysics, your basic idea of reality. And he refers here to Spinoza, who was a 17th century European philosopher, Baruch Spinoza. Really the explanation there, as Spinoza gives it, is that death is really not worth thinking about because death is not real. That is, that the metaphysical presuppositions or the metaphysical outlook, and by that I just mean the basic outlook on reality, before really, let's say, the 18th century, the 19th century, was really that being was the fundamental presupposition. That is that, and that things that were could never become nothing. As you see, he imagines here that he's speaking with Spinoza. Right? Let me make it a little bigger. If we could ask Spinoza, why should we not on occasion meditate upon death? He would no doubt answer. So this is him thinking of what Spinoza would say. Because death has no reality. And you should meditate only upon essentials, upon eternal things. So the supposition there is that you and I, not as physical beings, but as, let's say, metaphysical creatures, as creatures that are or have souls, are immortal anyway. So thinking about death is really not important because death has no reality. Death is really not something that ends us as human beings. And he goes on to say, and again, this is putting words in Spinoza's mouth, for by so doing, you will become like the eternal. That is, if you meditate upon eternal things, calm, self-sufficient, happy, indestructible, free. You will be directed in everything by reason, which cannot pass away. Thus, death is of no consequence to the free man and no fit problem for philosophical meditation. So this is a certain way, that a very broad way in which Gray is characterizing, let's say, pre-20th century philosophy. The supposition is that death really has no reality. And maybe the greatest reference here would be to John Donne's great poem, which we know as Death Be Not Proud. Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkst thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. There's a Christian outlook that death has no power over, well, in that case, the Christian, but in any case, it's a recognition that we have an immortal soul. So Gray is characterizing modern philosophy before existentialism in the 20th century in a certain way, and trying to explain why it didn't really talk about death that much, because it didn't really think death was such a big deal. Number two, what does it mean to say that we are chiefly creatures of comfort, not seekers of truth? And what are the implications of this for our consciousness of death? This is I think, a key quote on page 117, when he begins to really explicate what he takes to be the existentialist position. It comes right here. And the German existentialists hold that even the strongest of us know it rarely. And that rarely is the dread of non-being, which is such a contrast with the Spinoza attitude that Gray has as described in the beginning of the essay, the very notion that we become nothing at death, which we're familiar with from reading Epicurus, is a central part of what he takes to be existentialist philosophy. That is, the truth is that we are finite creatures. The truth is that we do come to an end, that we become nothing. And unlike Epicurus, the existentialist sees this as a traumatic experience for the human being, the realization of their finitude, the realization that at death they become nothing. Unlike Epicurus, who says, well, that just sort of frees you up to enjoy your mortality, for the existentialist, that becomes a moment of truth. Can you face the fact that you're finite? Can you face the fact that at death you become nothing? This notion of we are chiefly creatures of comfort, not seekers of truth, is an accusation against the typical person, really, us, that we avoid the consciousness of death. And the consciousness of death for the existentialist is a consciousness of our looming non-being, of that boundary situation of death that we are bound to come up against, and our unwillingness to face the truth about it. We are chiefly creatures of comfort. That is, I think from the existentialist point of view, we either tell ourselves stories about some mythic afterlife, or we live in the clouds, or we just avoid thinking about death. But we are not seekers of truth. We have to force ourselves to actually have a direct consciousness, to acknowledge in a substantive way, in an honest way, the fact that we are, in fact, finite creatures. Again, I'm not saying this is the only way to look at it. I'm trying to expound what I take to be Gray's interpretation of existentialism. Why is Geborgenheit a profound illusion? Well, Geborgenheit is just a German word that means security and safety that he chooses to put up there. Geborgenheit, as he says, it means safety, it means security, but he's thinking that that of being absolutely safe, of living in a kind of a secure and protected way, and that's what would mean to have this Geborgenheit outlook. And the reason it's a profound illusion is right here. I think he's explicating basically the Heidegger. We know that there are two important philosophers here for Gray, and one is Karl Jaspers, and the other is Martin Heidegger, as examples of the existentialist philosophy of Germany in the early 20th century. Our true condition is one of exposure. In reality, we are defenseless, naked to the winds of chance and blind accidents. So the reason that safety and security is a profound illusion is because the truth, according to the existentialist, of the human condition, the inescapable truth, is that it is constantly exposed to danger. And here we might draw upon Hans Jonas's idea of the burden of mortality, that we are faced at every moment with the constant we are faced at every moment with the possibility of becoming nothing, of death. And ultimately, we know that it will happen. We know that our own death is inevitable. So we live every moment in the face of death. So any notion that we are secure and safe is therefore an illusion, if that is indeed the human condition. Now, I think that at this point, it becomes absolutely clear that the only consistent view of existentialism is an atheist existentialism. That is, that sense of exposure, of being alone, of being subject to all of the whims of fate and chance and blind accident, is essentially an atheist position. Although Kierkegaard, who's mentioned here, was a Christian philosopher and in some ways very existentialist, and in some ways not. Which is just to say that I would say that pretty much everything we've read so far is at least doesn't have the notion of the Christian God, the Jewish God, the Muslim notion of God, of Allah, the Lord. Um, I'm just going to hit the pause button just for a second. I just want to qualify that by saying that Epicurus believed in the gods, but he did not believe in any kind of immortality of the soul. Okay. Number 4, Jaspers regards death as one example of a boundary situation. See page 118. What are the others mentioned and what do they have in common? Well, it's a surprising list because we can certainly intuitively see right away why death would be a boundary situation. And of course, the boundary is an impassable boundary, a boundary up against which we, as he says, shipwreck. It's a recognition that there are some things in life that cannot be changed through human action. We cannot evade them. We can only deal with them, right, in some way or another. And that's the essential characteristic, I think, that all of these so-called boundary situations have in common, is that we realize as human beings that there's just nothing we can do about them, that they simply have to be endured and accepted rather than seen as some problem to be gotten over. And he mentions guilt, suffering, and chance as examples of other boundary situations, which I think takes some thinking about, like, why those things would be associated with something like death. But if you think about something like guilt, for instance, that guilt is remorse about the past. And the thing about the past is that it's unchangeable. There's nothing we can do about it. So if we did something that we feel guilty about, it's a form of suffering, really, and anguish. There's nothing we can do to change the past. We simply have to accept the fact that we did something that we consider to be deeply wrong. That's what prompts guilt, I think. It simply has to be endured, like suffering. Physical and emotional suffering are simply part of our lives as living creatures. And although there's things that we can do to avoid it sometimes, and there's things that we can do to alleviate it sometimes, in terms of, painkillers, in terms of physical suffering, or therapy in terms of emotional or mental suffering. Suffering is simply something that sometimes has to be endured. So what the boundary situations have in common is that they are the big things in life that simply the human being cannot do anything about. And I, as I might have said in the videos, I think this really goes against the grain of human nature, because I see human beings as essentially problem solvers. And when they come up against a problem that can't be solved, that's a very frustrating experience. Number 5, according to Jaspers, what is it about death that we really fear? See page 120. If I'm not mistaken, what we really fear about death is exactly, according to Jaspers, is exactly what Epicurus thought it was absurd to fear, and that is we do actually fear becoming nothing. That is, it's the fact that we become nothing at death that inspires this dread. He mentions Epicurus here in passing. Talks about the dubious wisdom of Epicurus. Well, that's a little bit too easy. I don't think that Gray has thought as deeply about Epicurus as we have, frankly. And he's rejecting the Epicurean position. While I am, death is not. And when death is, I am not. Therefore, death is of no concern to me. That's a paraphrase of Epicurus, but I think it's pretty accurate. So he says, now it is true enough that I cannot actually experience my death. Good. We know that from reading Epicurus. And the consolation the positivists offer would be real enough if it were the fear of physical death that troubled us. But as Jaspers rightly insists, I think the thing about death which we fear is chiefly the prospect of no longer being, of vanishing into nullity. It is an existential dread. So according to Jaspers, and according to Gray's interpretation of Jaspers, I suppose, it's the very idea that we become nothing that inspires this dread. That is the thing about death that we really fear. And so here we get down to basics. He's rejected the Epicurean view that when we realize that death is not part of our possible experience, we just sort of relax and no longer fear it. This is a different interpretation. Well, maybe we fear becoming nothing. That's the very thing we fear. I think it's a very interesting inflection point in basically an atheist view. Either you're an Epicurean who views our becoming nothing as a comfort, or you're an existentialist who views our becoming nothing as a great challenge to the human being. It actually is a quite interesting point. And you sort of have to decide which you think is right. Number 6, what is the significance of the difference between realizing that all human beings die and realizing that I will die? See page 120, 121. Well, this is really the Heidegger notion that we avoid the consciousness of death by making it something abstract. We say human beings die. But to really accept the truth of death, one has to personalize it and say, I will die. Heidegger is the very bottom of 120. Heidegger's analysis of the impersonal pronoun in German, das Mann, the one, like they, as expressive of the fallen state of mankind, that is the fact that we're kind of asleep, that we refuse to acknowledge reality, has become well known. In English, we use more commonly the third person plural in an impersonal sense. They say, they do it, etc. So on and so on. The important thing is to say, if you say they die or everybody's mortal, that's not really acknowledging the truth of the situation, which is much more personal. To acknowledge the truth of the situation is to say that I will die. That is me, the person that I know as myself, will die. So it's a big difference. We can say all human beings are mortal or everyone dies, and that could still be sort of living in denial because we haven't accepted the truth of our personal finitude, of our personal mortality, of our looming personal death. Why do existentialists reject the idea of death as fulfillment? Well, I mean, the existentialist view, as I take it, or as I take Gray to be saying, is that we have to try to make every single moment meaningful in our lives. But life is now. We shouldn't expect our death somehow in some storybook narrative way to be the fulfillment of our lives. Fulfillment is something that we have to try to get at every moment because the moment is all we have because of our exposure. So the existentialist way is to think that, don't think of your life as unfolding like a story and the ending will make it all sort of tie it all together and make it meaningful. You've got to do that at every single moment. Number 8, what does it mean to live in the face of death? Page 122. Well, to live in the face of death, as I take it, and this is kind of a loose interpretation, is to live in the moment, that they're the same thing. If we are to live as temporal creatures, as creatures in time, the idea is that the present is all we have. The past is not here anymore. The future is not here yet. All we have ever is the present moment. And what we want to do is to grasp the reality of the present moment and live in the present moment. But to live in the present moment, given the human condition, is to be aware of our own death. So genuine, what is called here genuine experience, authentic experience, because it requires us to live in the moment, also requires that we have a consciousness of death, which is, again, why we avoid living in the moment, because we are chiefly creatures of comfort, not seekers of truth. So to live in the face of death is just to live in the fullest sense, because to live in the fullest sense requires us to live in the face of death, to be aware of death. Finally, and related question, according to Heidegger's ideas about time, death, and being, why is it so important to be open towards death? I think this is really just a continuation of the last question. To be open towards death is to be open to reality. As he says at the top here, once the full reality of personal death, as opposed to abstract death, personal death, you and me individually as persons accepting our finitude. Once we've done that, he says, the moment is informed with a sense of urgency and mission. So we cannot really live and be the people we really are until we are open to death. Because if we close ourselves off in our consciousness to the reality of death, we are in denial and we're not living in the moment. We're living somewhere else. To be right here, right now, as the people we are, we have to have a awareness. We have to have at least some acknowledgement of the truth of the situation, which is that we are exposed. We are at every moment exposed to the possibility of death. And so you'll see one of the things I emphasize in the videos is this Heidegger's notion of human existence is a being towards death. That is, it's essential to being a human being that we are mortal and that we are in time constantly moving towards our own end.